You check your phone before you check on the people in the next room. You scroll past a headline about a conflict on the other side of the world. You feel something for half a second. Then you move on. In the summer of 1914, a single gunshot did the opposite. It traveled through telegraph wires, through palace hallways, through the minds of kings and generals, and within 5 weeks, it had pulled 70 million men into uniform. You have been told World War I started because an Archduke was shot. That is true. It is also almost nothing. The real answer is far stranger. The real answer is that your brain, and every brain in Europe in 1914, was running on a piece of software written tens of thousands of years ago. Software built for small tribes. Software built for one simple rule. Protect your group. Fear the outsider. Repay every insult. That software was never designed for telegrams, alliances, and machine guns. But in 1914, it was handed all three at once. Start with the spark. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary rode through Sarajevo in an open car. A 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip stepped out of a crowd and fired 2 shots. The Archduke died within the hour. His wife died beside him. 1 man, 2 bullets. You might expect a funeral, an arrest, a trial. Instead, you got a chain reaction that historians still argue about more than a century later. Here is the part your textbook rushed past. Austria-Hungary did not go to war because it loved the Archduke. Researchers like historian Christopher Clark, who wrote the landmark study The Sleepwalkers, have shown that European leaders were not innocent men stumbling into catastrophe. They were gamblers who had spent decades building a system that made catastrophe almost inevitable. That system had a name: alliances. Germany had promised to back Austria-Hungary. Russia had promised to back Serbia. France had promised to back Russia. Britain had promised, vaguely but powerfully, to defend Belgium and lean toward France. Each promise was meant to prevent war. Stand together and no one attacks. That was the theory. But your brain does not run on theory. It runs on threat detection. When Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia, demanding near total control over the investigation into the assassination, it was not really asking a question. It was testing whether anyone would stop it. Serbia agreed to almost everything. Almost was not enough. Why? Because by then, the decision had stopped being about Serbia at all. Social psychologist Henri Tajfel, decades later, would run experiments showing something unsettling about the human mind. Tajfel discovered that you do not need a real reason to favor your own group and distrust another one. In his studies, he split strangers into groups using something as meaningless as a coin flip. And within minutes, people began favoring their own assigned group and treating the other side as a rival. No history, no conflict, just a label. Now imagine that same wiring, except the groups are not random strangers. They are empires with armies, monarchs with cousins on every throne in Europe, and populations primed for decades by newspapers insisting that their nation's honor was sacred and fragile at the same time. You were not built to calculate the deaths of millions. You were built to protect the 20 or 30 people in your immediate circle from the tribe over the hill. In July 1914, that ancient circuit was firing inside the minds of men who controlled telegraph lines and standing armies of millions. Mobilization made it worse. Once Russia began mobilizing its army to support Serbia, Germany faced a problem older than warfare itself: speed. Military planners had built schedules, the most infamous being Germany's Schlieffen Plan, that assumed whoever moved first would win. There was no setting for wait and see. There was barely a setting for negotiate. The machine, once switched on, was built to keep running. Do you ever say something you regret in an argument, not because you meant it, but because stopping felt like losing? Multiply that feeling by a continent, and you start to understand August 1914. Within days, Germany declared war on Russia, then on France. German troops marched through Belgium to outflank French defenses. Britain, bound by treaty and watching a smaller nation get steamrolled, declared war on Germany. The dominoes that had been standing for decades all fell within 72 hours. Here is the counterintuitive twist. Almost no one expected this to last. Soldiers on every side believed they would be home by Christmas. German officers told their families it would take 6 weeks. French generals had built their entire strategy, Plan 17, around fast, glorious offensives. The illusion was not laziness. It was psychology again. Historian and psychologist research into overconfidence bias, later formalized by researchers like Daniel Kahneman, shows that humans consistently overestimate quick, decisive outcomes and underestimate the messy, grinding reality of conflict. Generals in 1914 were not exceptions to this bias. They were textbook cases of it. What they got instead was a war unlike anything the species had built before. By the autumn, the fast war of movement had collapsed into something almost prehistoric and almost futuristic at once. Men dug trenches, narrow lines of mud stretching across hundreds of miles, because new weapons made the open charges of the old world a death sentence. Machine guns could fire hundreds of rounds a minute. Artillery could level a forest. Barbed wire turned no man's land into a killing field that swallowed entire generations in single afternoons. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, British forces suffered roughly 57,000 casualties on the first day alone. One day, 57,000. Why did men keep climbing out of those trenches, again and again, into machine gun fire, when survival instinct should have screamed at them to stay down? This is where the story stops being about kings and becomes about you. Social psychologist Stanley Milgram, in his famous obedience experiments of the 1960s, found that ordinary people would administer what they believed were dangerous electric shocks to a stranger simply because a man in a lab coat told them it was part of the procedure, not because they wanted to hurt anyone, because authority, uniform, and structure are some of the most powerful forces your brain responds to. Soldiers in the trenches were not robots, and they were not cowards. They were ordinary humans embedded in a chain of command that made disobedience feel more dangerous than death itself. The war that was supposed to last 6 weeks lasted 4 years. It pulled in colonies across Africa and Asia, drew the United States into European affairs for the first time at this scale, and by its end in November 1918, an estimated 17 million people were dead. Soldiers and civilians. Entire villages of young men erased from European maps. And here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The peace that followed did not fix the underlying problem. The Treaty of Versailles punished Germany so severely, demanding reparations and territorial losses, that it planted the resentment that a young Austrian corporal named Adolf Hitler would later weaponize. The ancient tribal circuitry that started the war in 1914 was never rewired. It was simply rearmed. So why does any of this matter to you, scrolling on your phone more than a century later? Because the same wiring is still sitting inside your skull. The same instinct that made millions of ordinary, decent people in 1914 close ranks around their nation and treat outsiders as threats is the same instinct that makes you feel a flicker of tribal loyalty when you see a headline about us versus them, whether that is a country, a political party, or a rival sports team. You are not living in trenches, but you are still running the same operating system that built them. The bullets that killed an Archduke in Sarajevo did not cause World War I. They simply found the fuse that thousands of years of human psychology had already laid. You checked your phone before you checked on the people in the next room. In 1914, an entire continent did something eerily similar. It checked its alliances, its honor, its pride, before it checked on the human beings who would actually pay the price. This is a sensitive topic involving large-scale historical violence and loss of life. If anything in this brings up difficult feelings, it can help to talk it through with someone you trust.